Can we trust the words of the Bible? This will be a trip with Wes Huff. He's going to Egypt. He is a scholar of biblical and ancient languages. We'll see what he discovered, what he shares with us. First time I've seen it, so let's check this out together.
With all the work that you've done in seminary, with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, with Muslims, with Mormons, with Jehovah's Witnesses, skeptics of all different stripes. All of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that that was a genuine critique if it was true. If that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
Hey, Andy Steiger here.
Wes Huff.
We are on our way to the airport, heading to Egypt to talk about the Bible.
There's a lot of confusion about the Bible, what it is, where it came from, can we trust it? Because the Bible didn't always look like this. The word Bible comes from the Greek word for books. But where did this mini ancient library of books come from?
What we called a Bible was put together over 1,600 years on 3 continents by close to 40 authors in 3 different languages. Some of its writers were kings, others teachers, shepherds, and fishermen. The early Christians inherited the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, a collection composed of the same 39 books we have in the first portion of our Bibles. Contrary to what many believe or have heard, the New Testament books were not chosen or voted on, but instead were recognized as the writings closest to the community surrounding Jesus. What we actually have is a direct connection to the life and teaching of Jesus. Jesus' disciples mentored others, who we call the Apostolic Fathers, who then comment on what books did or didn't have a history, going back to the words and teachings of Jesus.
So, Wes, why are we going to Egypt to talk about the Bible? I think a lot of people would assume that we'd be going to Israel.
Yeah, you know, if you're talking about the content of the Bible, where the events actually took place, then you're going to go to Israel. But if you're talking about the text of the Bible, the earliest copies of those that we have come from Egypt.
Hey, welcome to Egypt. We just got through security. We're here. We got our driver, Mohammed. He's going to be taking us to our hotel.
We're driving through the streets of Cairo. We're going to be heading over to the pyramids, see some of the Great Pyramid. We're going to be going to a few other archaeological sites before we actually head into the meat and potatoes of looking at some of the influential biblical sites. But for this first day, we're just going to be doing a little bit of the touristy stuff, making a day of it.
Welcome to Egypt.
Be careful with the camels in Egypt. They're ferocious.
It's just beautiful out here today. The sun's out, it's hot, a little bit sweaty. Having an incredible time here in Egypt.
Egypt has thousands of years of history with one of the world's oldest civilizations, a past that has direct crossover with stories we read about in the Bible. From Joseph and Moses to Jesus himself spending time here as an infant. But it's not just pyramids and pharaohs' tombs that make archaeology in this country so significant. Egypt lays claim to another title. Because of its dry climate and the fact that the papyrus plant, used as writing material in the ancient world, grew almost exclusively here, Egypt ends up being where the vast majority of our earliest surviving biblical manuscripts come from. But other books were also found. Ones that claimed to be Christian, but that the earliest church condemned. Egypt is a key location in exploring the story of this library of ancient books that we call the Bible. Given its fame, there's no surprise the Bible has held its share of controversy. Occasionally, we hear confusing narratives surrounding its origins, accounts of scandal, suppression, and rewriting. Stories of lost books and wild conspiracies still make news headlines 2,000 years later.
To be a lost gospel.
Story about the lost gospel.
I'm holding the Lost Gospel of Thomas.
Do these new readings finally prove that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married?
These clickbait headlines leave many questions. Can I really trust the Bible? The Bible hasn't always looked like it does today. For hundreds of years, it existed as independent scrolls and writings. But how can we know that this mini ancient library we call the Bible contains the right books? What about the other books that talk about Jesus from the ancient world that are not included in our Bible? One of the best known and potentially earliest of the books that weren't included bears the name of one of Jesus' immediate followers. Lost in the sands of Egypt for 1,800 years, its opening line sets the stage. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down.
We're here in Egypt, sailing on a felucca on the Nile River. And you know, it wasn't far from here, off in the Nag Hammadi Desert, where in 1945, a shepherd named Muhammad Ali, along with a number of his companions, were out in the desert looking for fertilizer. Now, what they found was not fertilizer, but their shovels uncovered a body and a 4-foot-high jar. In 1945, a lot of things were happening globally in the European and Pacific theater. Nobody was paying attention to a sheep herder and farmer in the backwaters of Egypt. And yet, a shepherd and farmer named Muhammad Ali in Upper Egypt, in the approximate location we're at today in Nag Hammadi, along with a number of his friends looking for fertilizer in the desert, uncovered a large earthenware jar. That jar, chief among its contents, was the Gospel of Thomas. Only 11 years before that, a philosopher and scholar in Germany named Walter Bauer published a famous monograph known as Heresy and Orthodoxy in Earliest Christianity. His thesis was that the scene of early Christianity was a theological quagmire. Groups were contending and fighting for who Jesus was. You didn't have just one portrayal of Jesus. And in that sense, it wasn't that there was a Christianity, but Christianities. The discovery of the Gospel of Thomas and other documents like it in 1945 and following confirmed that there were questions as to whether the Gospels that we have in the Bible were really an accurate and historical portrayal of who Jesus was.
A big question that comes up that a lot of people ask are, well, what about those other documents? Now, we were just recently in Cairo, Egypt, and we were at the Coptic Museum looking at one of the Nag Hammadi texts, the Gospel of Thomas.
I don't know if you've studied it at all, the background. I sure haven't. I'll be honest. But this stuff is really, Wes has done his dissertation, his PhD on this, and to actually look at this stuff through his eyes, it's really incredible. Wow.
We are here at the Coptic Museum, and I'm looking at the actual first page of the Gospel of Thomas.
So why wasn't that gospel included into our Bible?
You know, we do have these other books, these other Gospels, with names like Peter and Thomas and Mary attached to them. Nowadays, plagiarism is I take your work, Andy, and I put my name on, because I know you're smart, and I want to sound smart too. But realistically, nobody's going to read the Gospel of Wes. They just aren't. However, the early Christians knew who people like Peter and James and John were. And so instead of taking your work and putting my name on, I'm going to take my work, I'm going to take my ideas and my ideologies and concepts, and I'm going to put your name on it.
So in other words, if you want to get more readership, if you want more people to buy into the book, put a name, attach a name to it that they're going to recognize.
And yeah, exactly. And so you had these ancient groups that we refer to as the Gnostics, the Docetics. And what they did is they appropriated Jesus and put their theology on the lips of Jesus in later centuries. And then they attached the names for credibility's sake to those documents. But we know, based on both the content and based on how we date these manuscripts, that they're coming from times when Thomas, when Peter, when Mary, when Judas were long dead.
Many ancient texts like the Nag Hammadi Library ended up in small villages in rural Egypt, found by farmers and in some cases archaeologists. Documents like the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, and Judas found their origins with a number of mystic religious sects.
Now, isn't that interesting? Because that's what we do on YouTube with your thumbnail and things like that, names that are in the title that you want to get people to click so they will watch your work, your video. Putting my name on this video, it's not going to make you watch it. Putting Wes Huff's name on it, that may make you watch it all the way here.
From across the ancient world.
We're here in the desert of Egypt, not far from Al-Qasr. And we are quite literally in the middle of nowhere. It's beautiful, it's very hot, and there are no tourists here. We're in this lodge, and we are the only guests, I'm sure the only guests they've seen in a very long time.
After they discovered the Nag Hammadi Library in the desert, Muhammad Ali and his brother brought the documents here to Al-Qasr, the oasis in the desert. Not knowing what they really were, some were burned and destroyed, while others were collected and eventually got in the hands of antiquity dealers. After their discovery by the Bedouin farmers in 1945, they almost didn't survive. Some of the ancient papyri were tossed into a courtyard full of animals. Others used as kindling to cook bread. Many of these ancient papyri found in the desert, biblical or otherwise, often defy the odds when it comes to surviving for centuries.
This is the refrigerator, coffee maker. Brown walls. Wes.
Wes, I'm part of this home.
We're here filming in Egypt, and a big mistake that we made is we came in summer. And the heat here is shocking. It's just oppressive. And then on top of that, if it couldn't get any worse, we're in the midst of a sandstorm. So I'm gonna take you outside in a sandstorm, and I'll do my best to describe to you what a 45-degree sandstorm feels like. So the first thing that you need to appreciate is that there's sand in my teeth immediately. The full sun is coming down, which is baking you. And then the wind's blowing, which is drying out your skin. And the heat feels like an oven. So it feels like you're in a hot sand wind oven. And we've asked the people, we said, like, imagining that this is bad, and they're like, no, this is normal. They told us that it's worse in October. Apparently our guide has encountered 50-degree weather. That's 122 Fahrenheit. I don't want to have anything to do with that. I'm telling you that right now. Wes, when people ask me about these Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or others, one of the things I've often said to people when they ask me about why they weren't included in the Bible is I'll ask them, have you read these?
Yeah. Sometimes I simply say, well, you go read them and you tell me why they're not in the Bible. You think of a gospel, what do you think of?
I'm thinking of Jesus, I'm thinking of his life, his death, his resurrection, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're thinking of a narrative. You know what's interesting about the Gospel of Thomas is it's not what we typically think of when we think of a gospel. When we read the Gospel of Thomas, it's simply a list of 114 sayings, of questions being asked to Jesus and him answering his disciples. It's not what we think of when we think of the birth, the life, the teaching, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. It's a list of 114 sayings that are at times confusing, are at times very ambiguous. And when you read it, you find that there's some content that really sounds strange, especially to our modern Christian ears.
These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Simon Peter said to him, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
With these Nag Hammadi texts then, and you've got these different Gnostic Gospels, for example, one of the things I find interesting is that we're here in Egypt, and it's actually Egyptian names that you find in the text. Explain that, like what's going on, and how does that actually help us date those texts?
Yeah, when we're reading, say, the Gospel of John, we're getting names, or the Gospels, or Acts. We're getting names, and we're getting places that are in the geographical areas and are most frequent in first century Roman-occupied Palestine.
For example, you're getting Jewish names in the book of John or in the early Gospels. These are names that would date to that time frame in that area?
Yeah, not just names that were Jewish and that were being used in that time, but names that were popular within those particular decades that they're writing.
A series of scholarly studies has shown that, though Jews were located in many places across the Roman Empire, people's names often tended to be geographically located. By observing literary and archaeological artifacts, a list of common names can be clearly identified. By narrowing down the most popular names in places that Jesus lived, traveled, and ministered, and by comparing these to the list from the studies, an interesting correlation can be seen. Just as we see today with popular names, a qualifier or nickname is often used. For example, notice that when Matthew lists the disciples in his gospel, certain names have a qualifier or nickname and others do not. Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. As we would expect, the most popular names are those that have an added description. When we compare the most popular names in Judea and Galilee during the first century with names we see listed in key places in the biblical Gospels, we find that all the names with qualifiers match with what we'd assume if they were actually written in the time and place they claim to be narrating. In contrast, the Gospel of Judas only has two names that would fit, Jesus and Judas, but contains a host of other characters whose names match not with first century Judea or Galilee, like the biblical Gospels, but with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Consider how difficult it would be for someone living outside of the locations and times that these events took place to get the right names with the right qualifiers. We have 4 biblical Gospels with 4 different authors, and yet each gets this test of naming frequency and attribution right every time. A test and standard that the non-biblical Gospels simply do not pass.
You know, we might think that that's easy to try to come up with, but if I told you, Andy, that I wanted you to forge, don't do this, it's morally ambiguous, but forge a document, say from 17th century France. I mean, you know some French names. Jean-Claude.
Not a lot.
Okay. Jean-Claude, Francois.
Jacques Cousteau.
Right. What are the chances, though, you forged that document on my behalf and you got the exact names that were right in that century in France, or even in like a city like Paris? I want you to forge this document from 17th century Paris. Well, that's actually a lot harder than you might think, because names change in popularity from decade to decade, even year to year. And the interesting thing is, when we look at the Gospels and Acts, we find that the popularity of those names in those geographical areas, in those centuries and decades, corresponds exactly to what we should be seeing if that is exactly when it was written.
Given the evidence for the books that did end up in our Bible, and specifically the Gospels, we can have confidence that those books are the ones that should be included. In comparison to books like the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas, that really don't have any credibility to accurately portray the historical Jesus and hold on to true legitimacy as being included within the scriptural canon, our Bible stands true as a collection of books that should in fact be there. But granting that we have the right books, we also have to admit that we're standing 2,000 years after even the most recent of them was written. How do we know that even if those Gospels are supposed to be in our Bible, that we actually have the words that the authors of those Gospels wrote? What confidence do we have that the words contained in the Bible, and specifically the New Testament, haven't been tampered with changed, and adapted over the last 2,000 years? The answer to that question can also be found buried in the sands of Egypt.
You see that with baby names in the paper every year. Nice. Now that is an amazing video. I think he's got some more videos that I can look up and react to those as well. But this is incredible. But the most important thing about the Bible is that you read it. Read it, read it, read it to understand it. And don't read it when you feel like it. Read it until you feel like it. Okay? All right. I hope you enjoyed that video. Please subscribe. Come back soon, and we'll see some more stuff on the Bible and Christian themed stuff all over this channel. Okay? Take care. Bye.